Thanks for the welcome, Jose, and thanks for having me here today, guys. I'm not a native of Oregon, however, I do have some of my team here in Eugene, and so I'm just happy to be able to come visit and see them and meet you guys. So the talk I'm giving today about challenging investigative bias and incident response is really something that is pretty important, I think, for me personally, but also really interesting, not only from a technology perspective, but like a human perspective. So a little bit about me. Again, my name is Drea. I live in Orlando, Florida. I spend more time than is healthy in amusement parks with my child. So I'm also a mom of a 4-year-old little girl. I'm a member of the LGBT community. I am a veteran. I tick a lot of the diversity boxes that I know that we're here to talk about today. And as being a part of that, I think I can bring a lot of perspective, especially to what our profession needs from a more diverse incident response war room and in defending and fighting against the adversaries that we face every day. So, what is DFIR? So I don't know how many folks in here are familiar with digital forensics and incident response. A few people here are. A few people back there are. But this is, really the acronym is digital forensics and incident response. And we, breach response can be any number of things from a basic business email compromise, ransomware, cyber espionage, nation-state actors. We work with law enforcement, agencies, legal teams, privacy. It can be really any number of things. And because of that, a diverse expertise, not only from a technical perspective, but soft skills, is really required to be successful in our field. And of course, all of these things can result in expert testimony, which kind of brings in the scientific component of our jobs. So the 5 characteristics of a successful digital forensics and incident response team. Obviously, you have to have a natural curiosity. We're investigators. There's certainly law enforcement DFIR teams. There are enterprise DFIR teams. There are consultancies like our company employs. But all of us sort of have the same natural inclination to investigate or to pull things apart, to figure out what's going on. It's a key part of being interested in what you're doing every day, but also being successful. A high technical aptitude. So, digital forensics and incident response is sort of the highest point or the highest escalation of cybersecurity investigations. You typically have sort of a phased approach through a traditional security operations center, analysts that are looking at aggregations of data to determine fidelity of information. This is or is not a threat. This is or is not something that matters. And by the time those different versions of evaluation are complete, the digital forensics and incident response team may or may not get engaged. And because of that, it's not an entry-level role. I'll put it that way. There's a lot of, for the most part, folks that are highly seasoned, lots of experience in all sorts of different technical and soft skills from their previous experience. And so some of that could be, just the ability to triage in crisis management, looking at a situation in the heat of the moment and identifying quite quickly what's going on and how to proceed. We do host-based forensics, network forensics. We're looking at IDS and IPS solutions, malware analysis and reverse engineering, understanding network infrastructure and architecture, and really just how systems, applications, and appliances work and communicate. So a successful team needs to have all of those expertise included, right? And so not one person, in my opinion, well, maybe a few. There's a couple people I know that might have all of those skills, but most people do not. So it's very important to recognize what gaps exist on your team and how you're going to go about filling them to make sure that you have appropriate representation of everything that's needed. Communication. Communication is really important. You can be the best incident responder or forensic analyst in the world, but if you cannot communicate what you have identified appropriately, then you're not effective. So this comes down to being able to write well in deliverables, being able to communicate at all levels of technical aptitude, whether that's a peer at a customer company that might be highly technical, or their executive staff who really just needs to know, like, do we burn it down? Do we build it up? I don't know. You need to just give me the basics. So being able to communicate at all different levels is very important. Crisis management. This is probably, of all of these skills, one of the most important, in my opinion. There is not a single case where a customer or client or a leader of yours will come to you as an incident responder in the heat of the moment and be calm, right? Nobody's going to be calm. They're frantic. They're scared. It's something that a lot of people might exercise and try to prepare for, but nobody's going to be calm. So it's your job really to find that calm. Turn down the noise, look at the data, figure out what the next steps are, and make sure that you're showing that calm and confidence to your customers so that they have faith and trust that you know what you're doing. And then passion. This job is not for the faint of heart, okay? It's not a 9 to 5, but it is very exciting. It's very interesting. It can be very rewarding. But I think it's important as we start to talk about how do we fill some of the gaps that Christina mentioned when we're talking about, gaps in positions that are available and all of the open 700,000 roles that the White House is trying to fill right now. And you start looking at the demographics of individuals that we could tap, that untapped talent, those people that are just not representing the percentage of the workforce in a parallel way. And what would they be looking for? And being able to make sure that some sort of work-life balance is available for them, meeting them somewhere, whether that means, saying, yeah, okay, be an integrator. Take a few hours of your day to go to your kid's school or do whatever you need to do, recognizing that you're going to have to tap them on the shoulder probably on a Friday night when you don't want to have to do that. I feel like that give and take is really important. But it all goes back to the passion. If you're not passionate about it, it's not something that you can sustain. So those are the characteristics of a successful team. And again, I just want to reiterate, nobody has all of these inherently within them. It's just very, very important that you make sure that you're bringing enough diversity to the table to meet these challenges. So I'll just give you guys a second to read this quote because I'm not going to read it aloud. So I found this quote. I was actually researching a paper on this very topic, and that paper's titled, "Objectivity is a Myth That Harms the Practice and Diversity of Forensic Science." And that paper was focused on forensic science as a whole, not just digital forensics, but it really explored the expectations of human beings to be 100% objective, specifically those who may have to testify in a court of law. And it kind of explored really frankly, by the end of it, the fact that that's really not possible. And so how do we meet that, and what do we do about figuring out the difference between objectivity, subjectivity, and our own personal bias? So the theory there and the belief that objectivity maintains scientists are separate from the objects of their study, and I think we find along the way in time that's just not possible. It's impossible to completely separate yourself from anything that you're interested enough in to be doing analysis of or a scientific process of. So this theory suggests that scientists should just be truth seekers, fact finders, completely neutral, impartial, unaffected by bias. However, I think that somewhere in our objective truths and facts lies the subjectivity and the reality that our thoughts and our perceptions are shaded by our own experiences. And so here's a nice little history lesson that kind of gets us there, and I'll be as quick as I can without putting you to sleep. So positivism started in the 17th century. It went on for about 400 years. And during this period of time, there was this expectation of scientists that objectivity was critical, crucial, and absolutely necessary, meaning there was no room whatsoever for an individual to have a personal opinion or affect that bothered or showed any placement whatsoever within that scientific experiment or testing. There's a guy named Francis Bacon who created the foundations of positivism by suggesting the removal of subjectivity from science altogether. He referred to subjective obstacles as false idols, basically saying if you have things in your life that impede or reflect on your personal opinion when you're doing scientific research or testing, that those are things that they're their idols, they're things that you're worshiping, and you're unable to remove them from your thoughts. So fast forward into about 400 years, and we start, in the 20th century with the philosophy of science. And scholars kind of began to question the idea that scientists could separate themselves from their backgrounds, their biases, and experiences. And so they decided that science was a social construct, science is created by human beings, and they're inherently culturally embedded, context-dependent, and human-created. And then a little bit later in the 20th century, the social studies of science, and this is interesting because we all had social studies in school, and it's that whole sort of idea was a product of this interesting change in scientific theory and thought. But it basically highlighted that human scientists are those who created facts and laws, and so they're going to be inherently embedded. Facts and laws are going to be inherently embedded in our own personal perceptions and experiences. And then you have cognitive science and of course, psychology. And researchers in those disciplines finally determined that humans are unable to determine factors that bias them. Shocking, right? You don't really know. It's unconscious. It's neither inherent or inherent. It's unconscious. And so you're not able to actually create this separation. So you fast forward to today. Surprise, we are subjective. This is a part of who we are. How do we tolerate that then? And we start to introduce things like diversity, recognizing we can't just find it within ourselves. We have to deploy assistance from others. Sometimes that can be technology. Sometimes it's other human beings. Diversity can be a lot of different things. But the end goal, of course, is to turn down that noise, turn down that bias, and find the details that are within. Contributors to investigative bias. So investigative bias is essentially the suggestion that somebody's experiences or background or environment could impede their ability to be objective in an investigation. And so there's really four kind of key contributors to this problem. One is an individual's prior experience. So this could be demonstrated in more of like a traditional science by thinking of like a detective who might assume, if they're working a homicide case, they might assume something about that individual, like it's drug related or something else gang related, just because of maybe the neighborhood that it occurred in. They may have a case come in with like a missing teenager, and they may just assume immediately that teenager ran away because they have this historical experience. And sometimes those things are based in some facts, but at the end of the day, they can also just be based on what your perception is based on what you've done before. And I think, when we look at experience and attribution, so the cybersecurity equivalent of these assumptions is what we call threat actor attribution. And I think a victim of any crime wants quickly to know who the criminal was, why they were a victim of that crime, if that criminal is still there, what their intentions were. And that can sometimes force us to be a little bit quick on how we determine threat actor attribution. In fact, I think quite frequently we're too quick on how we determine threat actor attribution. But those attributions are often determined based on our prior experience, based on what we think. Oh, we think this is nation state. We think this is Soviet. We think, this is this ransomware threat actor or that. And that's fine. Hypotheses are important in science. But being incorrect can also completely derail an investigation if you're not very careful about how you handle those things. You can start running down the road of incorrect IOCs or TTPs. You can share incorrect information with your customer who is going to run with that at that point with whatever they possibly can, because again, they're a victim of a crime. So it's important to, I think, consider that. Methods. Methods of analysis are frequently recycled based on your past success, mentorships, and your education. So if you get a bunch of folks that went to the same school or had the same mentor, again, even one specific individual analyst who has had great success at certain forensic artifacts, oftentimes they're going to continue to go back and recycle that same process, and in doing so, you can miss a lot. The environment that you're in can create a bias, whether that's a customer that you're not particularly fond of, whether that's for personal reasons or others. If it's law enforcement and you're not particularly fond of the agency that you're working with for whatever reason. If you've got a lot of legal experience on one side or the other, they call that the my side effect. If you're typically working or testifying on the defense, for example, you may have an inherent perception to defend people, and that can create a bias. And then there's contextual bias. So it's not always important to have all of the information up front. Having all of the information up front can actually create an inherent bias. A good example of this is more in a traditional investigative example is the George Floyd murder investigation. During this murder investigation, the medical examiner actually refused to watch the footage of the event that happened because they were concerned that that footage would create a bias or precedence for, one, the physical science they were looking at. Meaning, if I see what's happening, am I going to immediately look for evidence to support that versus what is the science going to tell me? What is the evidence going to tell me? And also, watching anything like that, frankly, can create a personal bias or a feeling. And so context is important, and we'll talk about in a couple slides, but it's something that you should kind of layer on top, layer context as it becomes more and more important to investigation. Our challenges. So cybersecurity is a people problem. It's a people problem for a lot of reasons. One reason, it's because people themselves cause like 95% of cybersecurity breaches, so that's a people problem over here. But it's also a people problem from a resource perspective. Similar to what Christina mentioned before, we've got a lot of jobs available, and apparently not enough people to fill them. Some statistics that I think are just frankly interesting. There were 1,862 reported data breaches in 2021. I want to emphasize reported because I work a lot of cybersecurity breaches. Most of them don't get reported. Okay, so that number is a lot bigger as far as breaches that occur. Reporting a cybersecurity breach, it requires a lot of proof before a lot of public companies want to go forward with something like that. There was also a really interesting, Splunk and a couple other people did a survey and pulled back some interesting data. One piece here, 49% of companies suffered a data breach in the last 24 months. What's interesting about that is that's up 10% from the same survey the year before. So obviously we're trending in the wrong direction when it comes to how many people are being impacted. And then 6 trillion is a 2021 cybercrime damages number. It's supposed to be 10.5 trillion in 2025. But what's interesting about this particular metric is 6 trillion is actually the equivalent to the third largest GDP in the world, meaning if cybercrime itself were a country, it would have the third highest GDP in the world, only, of course, behind the United States and China. In that same survey that was done of the companies that suffered a data breach, 87% of those companies reported staffing challenges. And those challenges were either I can't find somebody skilled enough or I can't find people at all, whatever that might be. There were several subjective reasons underneath that 87%, but it's quite obviously a large number. And then just a couple metrics, because we are talking about diversity. 70, and my numbers are a little bit different from Christina's, and the reason I want to point this out, my numbers are specific to cybersecurity analysts, not cybersecurity as a whole. Okay, I'm talking about responders, folks that work cybersecurity breaches in response. 78.5% of cybersecurity analysts are male. That leaves 21.5% to be female. I'm sure there's a delta in there, but 21.5% versus 46.6% of the United States workforce. So clearly there's opportunity there. 72.6% of cybersecurity analysts are white. So that's not, it's certainly not, doesn't meet the parallel of what we expect from other diverse workforce within the United States. Another kind of interesting tidbit here is the average age of an employed cybersecurity analyst is 42 years old. So, and then 9% of all cybersecurity analysts are LGBT. I actually think that number is a decent reflection. And then I put some metrics in here that I thought were interesting, but maybe didn't need to be put on the slide. And I think it's because they support this 87% staffing challenge, this need for 700,000 more people. And that is the average time to identify a breach in 2021 was 212 days. The average life cycle of a breach in 2021 was 286 days from identification to containment. Now, these numbers hurt my soul. They're also, thankfully, not the numbers that me and my team have. But I do know that this is, unfortunately, reality for a lot of companies and people in the world that have to deal with these challenges. And then I think throwing bodies at things doesn't always necessarily fix them, but if there's a deficit, there's a deficit. So let's go ahead and start working to fill that gap. Another kind of interesting metric, the average cost of a malware attack on a company is $2.6 million. So it's a pretty expensive lesson for anybody to learn. All right, so what do we do to change all of this stuff? Prioritizing people. I mentioned this a few minutes ago, and that's, part of retaining great talent, like Christina mentioned, is meeting the needs and expectations of the desired workforce. If you want to hire more women, then, make the job more appealing to women. Some of that is with mentorships and examples, which we'll talk about in a minute. Some of that is making sure that we provide adequate health care and maternity leave. Like Christina mentioned, we have an all-encompassing leave. I don't even forget what we call it. It's like family leave. Yes, thank you. Might shock a lot of you in here because I do see there's a disparity of genders in here, but women are afraid to take maternity leave because they're scared that their job won't be there when they get back, okay? So making sure that they know that that isn't gonna happen to them is important. Making sure that you're providing those same opportunities for their male counterparts to take just as much leave. Yes, it's great for them, but it benefits everybody. And then, just making sure that folks know that they can be their authentic self when they show up to work. We spend more time with people at work than we do with our people at home. We do, all day. We're with them all day. You get about 4 hours with your family at night before you go to bed. So, it's important to be yourself, feel happy to be yourself. Hopefully, everybody around you feels happy to be themselves as well. And then making sure that folks know that once they get a job in cybersecurity, that it's not just a job, it's a career. A lot of the folks in, the Gen Ys and the Gen Zs that we have coming into our workforce today, they're more interested in making sure that they have a career path, making sure that they're passionate about what they're doing. They don't care as much about having video game systems in the break room. Or, these things are cool. Like I think we've got a beer keg in our break room. That's great. But they care less about that, and they care much more about making sure what they're doing is impactful, important, and something that they're passionate about doing. And so making sure you identify that and engage and empower them to feel that that's what they're doing every day. Mentorships and examples. This is interesting. When you look at television and movies, and hackers are represented today, they are not represented as women or minorities, right? Sometimes they're just a hoodie, and I suppose that could be anyone. But we're not representing this from a marketing or publicity perspective. And it also, honestly, especially in incident response, kind of evolved from the 1980s of a bunch of men from military and law enforcement backgrounds who started to pick up on the fact that these investigations needed to happen, and they evolved from there. And so what we have now is just not generations, it's only been, like 40 years, but iterations of folks who see people that look like them and strive to be like them. It makes complete sense that if you walk into a room and nobody looks like you, you may not necessarily feel like you belong there. So it's important that we, folks like us, the minorities, the women, whoever, show up to the room to be there to welcome those other folks with open arms and show them that this is a place that they can be as well. And then, of course, mentoring. Mentoring, I think, it goes for anybody. I think mentoring is important just to show folks what career progression and personal growth looks like. I'm in a leadership position. This is something I'm passionate about. So, obviously, I think that that's important. Meet the need recruiting. So this is something that I had struggled with myself for some time. Recently had a conversation with my friend Megan over here who reminded me that I needed to kind of check myself on this one. So when you look at recruiting, and I like to kind of think of cybersecurity as a competitive sport. There's winners, there's losers, there's winning, there's misery, offense and defensive, So it's a sport. And when you look at sports teams and how they recruit talent, especially professional sports teams use a draft system. And there's two perspectives on how you draft professional athletes. There's best on board, meaning you draft the best talent on the board. Doesn't matter if you need that position player. You assume that because that might be a franchise quality player, they're going to be good enough to move the needle to make you win regardless of the fact that you don't need them. And then there's meet the need drafting. And meeting the need means you look at the needs of your team, what gaps do you have, what can you bring to the table to improve, to make yourself more well-rounded. We need to meet the need. This doesn't mean that we stop hiring the best talent. It means we need to look at talent and decide what makes them the best for us, right? The last thing you need is a team of quarterbacks and nobody to catch the ball or intercept the ball or kick the field goal. You got all of one position player and you're lacking a lot of skills. So I think it's really important that we start to meet the need in our recruiting and in doing so, start making sure that we're targeting diverse candidates. And the way this slide is kind of laid out, I should have opened with this. On the left, we have people stuff, right? And on the right, we have more operational stuff. And when I first started talking earlier, I mentioned, I think you kind of look at this challenge in a couple different ways, and this is what I mean. So diversity in the war room, this aligns directly with the meet the need recruiting. Again, you've never seen a team of all quarterbacks go and win a football game, right? So you got to make sure that you've got a diverse team, you can field a team of expertise to be well-rounded. That doesn't necessarily mean just diversity in gender or minority, but it can also mean skill sets. So making sure that when you're in the war room, you're bringing everybody to the table that can be party to making the situation better and responding better. Sorry, I've lost my place here. Okay, peer review and blind review. This goes back a little bit to just objectivity versus subjectivity. The best way to tackle this particular challenge is to invite other people to collaborate and contribute, especially when you start talking about delivering content or reporting on content. So making sure that you have a peer review process, a blind review process, checks and balances, QA, whatever you want to call it. It's really important. There was an interesting report or research that was done just a few years ago. 40 different digital forensic analysts were provided with the same investigative packet. It was like a case, it was evidence, the same tooling or capabilities to investigate the case. All 40 people came back with a different report. I'm sure there were a lot of things that were similar, of course, but they highlighted different things. They documented things differently. Several of them obviously missed certain things. And this comes to kind of a bigger separate topic of how forensic science creates a framework of reporting that's equivalent across the board. But for the purpose of this talk, what it really shows is everybody thinks differently. Okay? Everybody reports and documents things differently. So the more people that you have contributing to whatever your final product might be or whatever your final hypothesis or conclusions might be, the more well-rounded that's going to be. And sequential unmasking. So we talked a little bit about before, context, and what it means to have the right amount of information at the right time so that you're not unnecessarily creating bias. And so sequential unmasking allows analysts to look at data in sequence that makes the most sense and which will minimize that noise and that bias. So on my team, we have created some automation in AI that we call artifact constellations. And I'm looking at them back there right now, smiling at me. The idea behind artifact constellations is to work through evidence in a triaging process where we review artifacts against known indicators, known relationships, and a timeline. So we use our threat intelligence. We use things that we know, that we've seen in the past, not just the atomic IOCs. What we call atomic IOCs are things that change very low fidelity. They change constantly, but things that have a higher fidelity, things that we can be sure about, seeing when we see them, they know they mean something. Being able to put things together and create a constellation, and we use those tools in automation to help float that high fidelity information to the top. And then we add the human analysis on top of that. It allows us to be extremely efficient, but it also allows us to have a high level of confidence that we're looking at the right parts of data at the right time. So I will just close with reminding everybody here, the threat actor community is always a step ahead of us. They have an extremely diverse community. There's a really famous study that was done by McKinsey that showed that companies with optimal gender diversity are 15% more likely to outperform their peers, and then those with optimal ethnic diversity are 35% more likely to outperform their peers. And so I think those two statistics together really show, hey, if we're a step behind and our goal is to catch up, or frankly just move the needle a little bit, right? There's a pretty big opportunity here for us to do that just with basic diversity in the war room and in the response teams. Yeah, so that's it. Thanks for having me on.